My name is Denise Allen, and I'm curator at the Frick Collection. And thank you all for coming on this blisteringly hot evening to listen to a lecture on Bellini St. Francis. Before I do the introduction for Charlotte Hale, I'd like to make a couple announcements. The first is that this lecture is the second in a series of lectures dedicated to Bellini and Venetian painting. The third is scheduled for Wednesday, the 29th of June, and it is going to be delivered by Susanna Rutherglen, Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Frick, and it is entitled Bellini to Veronese, Ornamental Paintings of the Venetian Renaissance. And if you don't have your pens and pencils or your daybooks with you, it's on the back of the little program, if you'd like to keep it. The other announcement I have is that the oval room where the Frick St. Francis is installed for this exhibition, and the multimedia room on the side of the garden court will be open until 7:30 p.m. tonight. And Charlotte Hale has kindly asked that you hold your questions after she finishes the lecture, because she would like to address them in front of the painting. Okay? So if you have them, go out and do it that way. Now, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to the Frick for the second Robert H. Smith Family Foundation lecture on Bellini St. Francis in the Desert. In the first lecture 2 weeks ago, Keith Christensen brilliantly presented his insights into the painting's subject and meaning. Tonight, Charlotte Hale will reveal the discoveries made during the technical investigation of the picture when it was at the Sherman Fairchild Paintings Conservation Center at the Metropolitan Museum of Art during March and April of last year. Charlotte Hale trained at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She has been a paintings conservator at the Metropolitan Museum since 1987. The range of pictures she has treated is broad. It spans from the early 15th century to the late 19th, and even includes a brief foray into the 20th century. Beyond that, Charlotte Hale combines her talents as a conservator with a special focus on the technical examination of pictures. Now, living with great works of art like Bellini's St. Francis is an extraordinary privilege, but it also presents its own particular burden. In order to attempt to do justice to this marvelous painting, all of us seek to better understand it. Although scholars as august as Millard Meese, John Fleming, and Marilyn Lavin individually have interpreted the St. Francis, this encompassing picture continues to transcend any single scholar's point of view. In light of this, our approach has been to open up the picture to the widest possible range of scholarly inquiry by presenting the results of its recent technical examination in a focus exhibition. You can view some of these discoveries in the beautiful videos crafted by the curator of this exhibition, Susanna Rutherglen, who worked in collaboration with Lisa Candage and with the generous guidance of Charlotte Hale. When the Frick St. Francis was at the Met last year, Michael Gallagher initiated and supported a study day that brought together curators, scholars, educators, and conservators from the U.S. and abroad. At this event, Charlotte Hale presented her meticulously rendered technical results. Her infrared reflectogram, composed of over 3,000 digital captures, which showed how Bellini conceived the picture, and her extraordinary photomicrographic images that allowed us to see the picture in detail, never as before. These results captivated and stimulated our discussions, but most importantly, during that day, it was Charlotte's cogent, carefully deliberated comments that reined in enthusiastic and potentially overly enthusiastic interpretations of the picture, and kept drawing us back to the magic of that painting and to the process of its making. Technical examination of a painting, which includes taking X-radiographs, capturing and composing the reflectogram, as well as performing microscopic photography, is not a dry forensic science. These methods are tools that demand long years of training and experience. Interpreting their results requires an expertise that is equally hard-won and exquisitely calibrated. Charlotte Hale brings both aspects of this technical expertise to her work. She has labored tirelessly on the Bellini project and has shared her knowledge in ways beyond measure. And for that, all of us at the Frick, and all of you, can be truly grateful. Charlotte Hale is that rare colleague who is esteemed not only for the results that she delivers, but also for the example that she sets. Working with her is a privilege that entails but a very light burden. It is one of being inspired to do better in order to meet the standard that she sets so high. And that standard is nothing more and nothing less than what is demanded by a great painting. Please join me in welcoming Charlotte Hale for her lecture, Bellini St. Francis in the Desert, New Discoveries.
Thank you, Denise, for that very kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, one of the most beautiful and best-loved paintings in North America, is also one of the most enigmatic. Volumes have been written about the picture, but questions surrounding the circumstances of its creation and exactly what it depicts have remained unanswered. In March of last year, in preparation for the exhibition here at the Frick, St. Francis came off the wall of the living hall and left the building for the first time since it arrived in 1915, traveling 10 blocks up Fifth Avenue to the Paintings Conservation Department of the Metropolitan Museum for an extensive technical examination. The 5 weeks that the St. Francis was with us at the Met was also an unprecedented opportunity for scholars to study and discuss the painting. For all of us, having the painting in the studio was something we'll never forget. In addition to an overview of how this remarkable picture was made, this talk will focus on some key issues that the technical examination sought to address. What can the materials and technique tell us about the painting's place in Bellini's development? Can technical examination elucidate the subject? And to what extent are we seeing the painting as it looked in Bellini's day? How has it changed over time? And how does this affect our understanding and experience as we look at it today? Like the great majority of Bellini's paintings, St. Francis has never been securely dated. Bellini's birth date is uncertain. The first documented reference to his existence is from 1459, when he's recorded as owning a house in the Venetian parish of San Leo. He later lived in the adjacent parish of Santa Marina. This is the Campo as it appears now. He died in 1516 and was buried beside his brother Gentile in the Basilica of Santi Giovanni e Paolo. Recognized as the foremost painter in Venice, he had a prodigious output during his long life and ran a busy workshop. While many of his paintings are signed, only a handful have dates inscribed. The first painting by Bellini that can be securely dated is from his maturity, The Madonna of the Little Trees, signed and dated 1487. This is later than the dates that have been proposed for the St. Francis, which range from 1475 to 85. The paintings most closely associated with the Frick picture are the Resurrection and the Transfiguration, both small altarpieces made for funerary chapels. These three paintings are comparable stylistically and in terms of scale. The Resurrection was probably painted between 1475 and 77 for the chapel of Marco Zorzi in the church of San Michele in Isola. The Transfiguration for the chapel of Archdeacon Fioccardo in the Cathedral of Vicenza is now generally accepted as having been painted around 1479. The first mention of the St. Francis was not until 1525, when the Venetian connoisseur Marcantonio Michiel described it in the house of his friend Taddeo Contarini, saying that it had been begun for Juan Michiel. But the painting's commission and early history are still not fully understood. Like the majority of Bellini's output, the St. Francis is on a wood panel support. It's painted on poplar, 3 unequally sized boards of tangential cut, diagrammed here over the X-radiograph. 3 original butterfly inserts were used to strengthen the join between the 2 larger boards. The panel was originally supported by vertical cross pieces at the sides, but these have long been removed, the panel thinned, and a wooden cradle attached to the reverse. Excuse me. I'll be talking more about the panel a little later. The support was prepared for painting in the traditional manner using gesso, a putty of gypsum and animal glue, coarser layers on the bottom, finer on the top. We can see the gesso, originally white, now darkened and patinated, on the unpainted borders of the panel. On this surface, Bellini laid out his design. There are no surviving preparatory drawings for St. Francis or for any of Bellini's paintings. Indeed, very few drawings, preparatory or other, can be attributed to Bellini. This is one of them, an allegory of fortitude. Given the complexity of the composition of the St. Francis and its carefully observed and rendered details, Bellini must have made both compositional and study drawings of the type made by his father, Jacopo. Dürer recorded a meeting with Bellini in 1506 and said that when preparing his painting, The Madonna of the Rose Garlands, while in Venice, he used a large number of detailed studies, a technique he learned from Venetian artists. While we don't have much on paper, what we do have is many highly detailed underdrawings by Bellini, found beneath his paint layers. Largely hidden to the naked eye, we can image these underdrawings through the paint using a specially designed infrared camera. Bellini's technique is characterized by very careful planning, of which his underdrawing was the cornerstone. However, the degree and handling of underdrawing varies considerably according to different areas of the composition. In each, he recorded as much or as little as he needed, anticipating the layers of color that would come next. There's no evidence of any tracing or other transfer technique. Everything was drawn directly on the gesso using very fluid carbon-based paint and a fine brush. The architecture of the little town was underdrawn meticulously. In addition to the outlines of the buildings, the artist drew in even tiny details like balconies, windows, and chimneys. In the towers, each tiny corbel was carefully delineated with ruled lines, joined with freehand semicircles at the top. These tiny dots are actually little pools of paint that formed at the end of the stroke when Bellini lifted his loaded brush off the surface. A number of minor changes can be seen between the drawn and painted image. For example, a chimney on the roof of the large tower was drawn but not painted. Instead, it was covered up by the foliage of the laurel tree. And here is a little door within a door that was never painted. These are a couple among numerous small changes that underscore Bellini's tremendous care and attention to detail at all stages of making of the painting. A more significant change is seen in the bridge, which was underdrawn as a post and lintel footbridge that extended onto the right bank rather than behind it. The underdrawn bridge resembles the one in Bellini's Crucifixion in the Museo Correr. In rethinking the bridge, Bellini first drew in the arches, including the broken ends of the ruined arch at the left. In contrast, the rock formations were underdrawn in a rather free and cursory manner, loosely indicating the facets of rock and areas of shadow. In the complex area of the saint's study, every element was carefully outlined in the underdrawing. Though this painting is essentially a landscape, to render the study area, Bellini used a perspective scheme that would have been familiar to him from the work of his father. Jacopo Bellini was fascinated by the depiction of perspective. In this drawing from his British Museum sketchbook, the construction of the roof of the barn recalls the construction of Francis's lectern. Many of Giovanni's paintings show perspective schemes, though generally in the more predictable context of architectural features or tiled floors, or both, as in this early work, The Blood of the Redeemer. The use of a perspective scheme in the St. Francis was established by Joe Godlar, chief conservator here at the Frick, and will be explored in a future publication. Even with the scheme in place, the rendering of the perspective of the bench, lectern, and book appears to have presented some problems for the artist, as indicated by numerous adjustments to his underdrawn contours during the process of painting. For example, the red lines show Bellini's initial rendering of the front ledge of the lectern and the pages of the book, before he corrected the perspective as he painted. There's extensive underdrawing in the figure of the saint, much finer and more controlled than that seen elsewhere. The underdrawing of the head is especially delicate and detailed. This is essentially a portrait drawing from a model. The contour of the head is drawn, including fine testing lines around the cranium, and the tuft of hair on the forehead is emphatically marked with 3 short lines that were scored into the gesso with a stylus. The saint's open mouth was emphasized from the outset with a heavy black line of underdrawing inside the bottom lip. So we know that Bellini planned this feature in advance, even if we don't know if he's singing or gasping in rapture. The form of the face is modeled with very delicate hatching, while the shadows in the cowl are indicated with bolder, very regular hatching across the form. Bellini always paid great attention to the depiction of hands, recognizing their importance in portraying emotion and expression. On the right is a detail from his astounding Pietà, the pinnacle of the Pesaro altarpiece. Here, too, the hands are focal points of the composition. They feature many small shifts from drawing to painting, and here, a pentiment in the right sleeve, which was originally painted less full. The foot was initially drawn and painted a little broader, and the contour was refined as the artist continued to work. At the bottom of the foot and robe are heavy lines of secondary underdrawing. Bellini added these after the underpaint of the foreground had been laid in order to reinstate these contours. The most emphatic is a line indicating the shadow cast by the saint. An unusual feature of the underdrawing are hatched lines that radiate from Francis's shoulders. This is a technique commonly used in drawings to situate a figure in space. And here for comparison is Bellini's drawing of a bull, which shows hatching in the background following the line of the bull's back, as well as hatching and cross-hatching within the form, similar to that seen in many of Bellini's underdrawings. But the radiating lines are not something I've seen in other underdrawings by Bellini. However, this is an area in which the artist made changes as he worked, as I'll describe later, so his intention with these marks is not easy to interpret. So how does the underdrawing of the St. Francis relate to that seen in other paintings? Recent studies using infrared imaging have shown that the manner and extent of Bellini's underdrawings changed considerably in the course of his long working life. Given this trajectory, it follows that underdrawing could be used as a factor in the dating of his paintings. This is broadly true, though the development is not linear and is complicated by the artist's large workshop in his middle and later years. On the screen is an infrared photograph showing the underdrawing of an early work, the very beautiful Davis Madonna and Child in the Met, dating to the early 1460s. The composition of this painting was laid out using two techniques: incised lines for the folds of the Madonna's robe, a technique associated with tempera painting, and the brushed underdrawing seen in this image. The contours, facial features, and folds of skin and drapery are delineated with thick lines, while the modeling is indicated with hatching, seen here most clearly in the cheek of the child. In the underdrawings of paintings from the early 1470s, his contour line thins out somewhat, and his interior hatching becomes finer and denser, such that he's essentially creating a monochrome chiaroscuro image prior to any application of color. This is an infrared photograph of the Madonna's robe from the Pesaro altarpiece. Paolo Pino, in his Dialogo della Pittura of 1548, disparaged his elaborate underdrawings for their extreme diligence, which he considered wasted effort, since they would be concealed with paint. However, Bellini clearly considered these carefully structured underdrawings essential for the rendering of light and shade at the earliest stage of creating his pictures. Here in the Met's Rogers Madonna from the late 1480s, the outlines are much finer and more searching. The underdrawing in many pictures of the 1490s and beyond reflects the expansion of Bellini's workshop due to the artist's commitments in the Ducal Palace and the demand for private devotional paintings. Here in the Brera Madonna and Child from 1510, hatching has been eliminated entirely, and all that remains is a shorthand contour drawing, signifying that the composition has been traced from a full-scale preliminary drawing or cartoon, a technique that the workshop used extensively to replicate his designs. The underdrawing of the Resurrection, St. Francis, and the Transfiguration, all of which feature very similar fine hatching in the shaded areas, slightly stronger contours, reaffirms the very close proximity of these paintings. Directly over the underdrawing is a thin priming or imprimatura of lead white in oil, so thin that the underdrawing would show through it. This imprimatura would have sealed the porous gesso and maintained the luminosity of the ground. In a manner later described by Vasari, it would have been spread over the surface and then smoothed with the palm of the hand to distribute it evenly. The texture of hand and fingerprints from the imprimatura is seen throughout the painting, principally in the thinner passages of paint. These hand and fingerprints, so evocative of the workshop process, are more likely those of an assistant than the painter himself, and their visibility has increased over time as the overlying paint has become more transparent or worn. Hand and fingerprints deriving from the imprimatura are by no means unique to Bellini, but the extent to which they're visible is characteristic for the artist. You can see how easily they might be misinterpreted as manipulation of the surface paint with the artist's hands, but in all these cases, the texture is being transmitted from below. Over the imprimatura, using the underdrawing as a guide, Bellini began by laying in his paint layers. In this X-ray detail, you see how he started by underpainting the landscape background up to the edges of the buildings and other forms which were left in reserve to be painted directly on the ground once the background was dry. This so-called reserve technique is characteristic of the artist and his contemporaries and creates a distinctive frieze-like appearance in the X-rays of his paintings, where thinly reserved forms often appear dark, that is, X-ray transparent, against X-ray opaque areas of sky or landscape. Even very small and slender forms are reserved. Note here that the saint's thumb and the delicate structure of the shelter and vine at the right. And here's an example from a later painting, The Assassination of St. Peter Martyr. Though the X-ray of this work shows its many damages, you can still see the characteristic frieze-like appearance of the reserved figures and trees. Indeed, the reserve has captured the silhouette of the initial pose of the assassin in the lower left, his dagger raised above the saint, before Bellini painted him sinking the dagger in, an unusual pentiment for the artist. Bellini's calculated approach to laying in his composition derived from his beginnings in egg tempera, a technique where changes were difficult and planning was essential. The younger vanguard of Venetian painters like Titian, who began painting in oil, did a lot more of their composing on the panel or canvas, often making significant revisions as they worked. This early painting by Titian is full of changes, including in the pose of Christ. You can see the earlier position of his legs in the X-ray on the right. For Bellini, using a reserve technique kept his underdrawing in view and maintained the definition of each form. Crucially, it also preserved the luminosity of the white ground, contributing to the overall lucidity of the painting. The use of reserve technique surely relates to one of the features that makes his paintings so quietly compelling, the lyricism of his negative spaces. Bellini strikes a perfect balance between objects and the spaces around them, so that every part of the painting is activated with rhythmic grace. Hanging side by side at the Met are two paintings by Bellini of the Madonna and Child. The Davis Madonna from the early 1460s shows the strong influence of both the artist's father, Jacopo, and his brother-in-law, Mantegna. The other from the late 1480s shows the artist's mature style. A significant difference in the appearance of these paintings is also due to the fact that one is executed in the traditional medium of egg tempera and the other is in oil. In his guidebook to Venice of 1581, Francesco Sansovino said that Bellini's San Giobbe altarpiece, dated around 1478 to 80, was his first painting in oil on panel. While we now know that the artist was painting in oil many years earlier, the desire to ascribe a moment to Bellini's first oil painting shows the importance that was accorded to the oil medium, as well as contemporary recognition that the transition from tempera to oil was a significant part of Bellini's development. Vasari credited Jan van Eyck with the discovery of oil paint, and the Sicilian painter Antonello da Messina, whose first exposure to oil painting was seeing a picture by Van Eyck in Naples, with the transmission of Netherlandish oil technique to Venetian painters when he visited Venice in 1475-6. While the true story of the transition from egg tempera to oil south of the Alps is a great deal more complex, Vasari was right to link the innovations of oil technique with Netherlandish painters. Netherlandish paintings were collected and highly valued in centers like Naples and Ferrara, as well as Venice, and their influence is manifest in the early work of Bellini and his contemporaries. Bellini was always highly responsive to other influences, both stylistic and technical, that would enhance his own work. On the left is a crucifixion by an anonymous Flemish painter, a painting known to have been in Venice early on. Bellini's early treatment of this subject was unquestionably influenced by such examples. For Italian artists in the 15th century, drying oils would have been familiar mediums for varnishes and as binders for translucent colored glazes over metal leaf and tempera. It was not such a large step for painters to begin to use them for more than just finishing layers. Recent studies of paintings by Bellini have shown that he was using the oil medium as early as the 1460s, as here in the Carrère Transfiguration. By the time that Antonello visited Venice, Bellini had already painted his magnificent Pesaro altarpiece using drying oils, according to a recent study. When Michiel referred to Bellini's St. Francis in 1525, he called it specifically an oil painting. Since its arrival at the Frick, it's been catalogued as tempera and oil on panel. It's possible that the hatched appearance of the flesh, which is due to the underdrawing showing through, led to this designation. Proper identification of the paint medium was a key component of the recent study, and medium analysis conducted by Julie Arsenolou of the Met's Department of Scientific Research showed that it was indeed painted in a drying oil, and from now on the painting will be catalogued as oil on panel. Painted within a few years of the Pesaro altarpiece, the artist is clearly at ease with the handling of the medium, using it to a variety of effects. However, there are some areas of fine cracks that formed as the paint dried and aged. Similarly localized medium defects are seen in others of his early oil paintings, as Bellini familiarized himself with the medium, as here in The Resurrection, which has much more extensive and pronounced drying cracks in the darker passages of the landscape. In many respects, the technique of Bellini's early paintings in oil echo the luminosity and simple structure and tight handling of his early tempera paintings. Using the oil medium, the translation of his acute observation of the world into paint achieved new transcendence. He quickly saw the potential of oil to describe different surfaces, and his varied manipulation of the medium is one of the reasons that his paintings are so compelling and invite such a visceral response. The waterspout, for example, was painted with a few buttery strokes extending the length of the spout, and the water with just a few touches of white where the light catches it as it twists over the rim. We get used to seeing images enlarged on the screen, but it's worth remembering that this detail is about an inch wide. Much of the surface is activated with brushy paint strokes, as here in the buildings, and in the saint's robe, particularly here in the sleeve, and in the tree trunks, where the strokes seem to mimic the bark. The consistency of handling throughout the painting demonstrates that Bellini painted the entire picture himself and didn't delegate any part of it to an assistant. In a few key areas, he manipulated the medium to create raised areas of paint or impasto that would catch the light, as here for the highlights on the clouds and the highlight on the hill, and here in the saint's belt, where long strokes of bodied paint have been scraped through with an implement. Most likely he just turned his brush around and used the wooden end to simulate the light catching the rough texture on the rope. Bellini went on to use more boldly impasted highlights in his paintings. While these manipulations of paint are both beautiful and effective, they never call attention to themselves. This is so typical of Bellini. There are no gratuitous effects to trip the eye. Everything works towards an overall harmony. Bellini's use of evident brushwork and impasto anticipated and influenced the work of his younger contemporaries, Giorgione and Titian. He also made creative use of a wet-in-wet technique impossible with fast-drying tempera. Here in the stump of the fig tree, he created the cracks or checks in the newly cut exposed wood by pulling dark strokes through the wet cream-colored paint. The rock face is painted with a degree of freedom not seen in the rest of the picture, in a very brushy, multi-directional manner. In the rock above and to the right of the saint's head, there's a crevice enlarged in this photomicrograph, which is made by pulling a brush through still wet, pale-toned paint. In addition to freely worked and textured paint, Bellini was also able to manipulate his oil medium to achieve great precision on a miniature scale. These tiny grasses at the tops of the rocks are seen only at very close quarters. This is a typically understated feature that Bellini uses in other paintings. It serves to record his close observation of nature and to soften the edges of the form. And like so many details, it's highly decorative. Here we see the same feature used in his very beautiful St. Jerome in the National Gallery, London, a painting once assigned to the Bellini workshop, but whose conception and handling compare closely with the St. Francis. Bellini was a great painter of pebbles. The smallest pebbles in the foreground appear to be made from paint flicked from a stiff loaded brush, an effective technique known to painters and decorators then and now. His mastery of the medium was such that he was able to paint incredibly fine lines, like those of the tasseled page marker at the bottom of the book. Though struck by a vision, Francis has kept his place. To Bellini, recording this kind of detail was irresistible. Similarly, on the rope of the bell that Francis would have used to ring out the canonical hours, he painted the tiny knot that would have made it easier to get his grip. Possibly my favorite area on the painting is the dancing, looping tendrils of the vine. See how beautifully this tiny detail is observed and rendered, with little gaps left in the tendril where it crosses over itself. As Keith Christensen, chairman of European Paintings at the Met, discussed in his lecture from this podium 2 weeks ago, the rich, exquisitely painted details of the St. Francis were intended to reward slow, attentive looking. This is an aspect of Bellini's paintings that was commented on by contemporaries. Michiel described this landscape as wonderfully composed and detailed, and Lorenzo da Pavia, writing in July 1504 to update Isabella d'Este on the painting she had commissioned, announced that it had finally been completed. "Everyone who's seen the picture thinks it's wonderful," he says. "It is highly finished and meant to be seen up close." In the same letter, de Pavia described Bellini as excellent in color, and this characterization endures. Venice was the center of the color trade, uniquely situated between East and West. Venetian color merchants served local glass, ceramics, and dyeing industries, in addition to the painting market. Like his fellow artists and artisans, Bellini was able to select from a range of pigments of extremely high quality. However, this range was tiny compared to what was available to artists a few hundred years later. Part of Bellini's excellence in color lay in his ability to manipulate his pigments to maximum effect. His use of color is particularly interesting in the St. Francis, whose subject, the saint, in his drab friar's habit in a rocky landscape, places limitations on the palette relative to works that had opportunities for multi-hued costumes. The intense blue sky was painted with ultramarine, a pigment made from lapis lazuli, mined in the quarries of Badakhshan in modern Afghanistan, and transported to Venice along the Silk Road. Ultramarine was a very expensive pigment, and its lavish use here in the sky speaks to the importance of the commission. The lighter part of the sky was underpainted with a brushy layer of lead white, which can be glimpsed, I hope you can see this, at the very edges of the painting on the unpainted border. This would have provided a brilliantly reflective base for the overlying blue. At the right, you see a tiny cross-section of paint, smaller than the period on a printed page, one of very few samples taken primarily from the edges of the painting to analyze the pigments and paint stratigraphy, analysis undertaken by Silvia Centeno and Mark Wypiski of the Department of Scientific Research at the Met. The thick top layer is a mixture of ultramarine and lead white, which lies over the lead white underpaint. The sky is more intensely blue, with no lead white underlayer and a higher concentration of ultramarine towards the top. When the painting was with us at the Met, the question that visitors most commonly asked was, were the rocks really meant to look so blue? Bellini often mixed brightly colored pigments into ostensibly gray or brown features, but here the use of color is overt. Examination showed that the rocks were indeed painted using azurite, a blue mineral extracted from sources in Germany and Hungary. Azurite has a slightly greenish cast relative to the more purplish ultramarine of the sky. You can see in this photomicrograph the individual particles of azurite, which was mixed with lead white to make an opaque, bright blue. The flat rock of the foreground was treated differently from the boulders and rock face. As in the sky, Bellini made selective use of underpaint, in this case, a light, warm yellow, which can be seen where it meets the saint's robe, as well as in the lower layer of this cross-section. The warm yellow is composed of yellow ochre, lead white, and a little carbon black. The brilliantly colored underpaint gives resonance and brilliance to the foreground, literally lighting up the stage. Bellini also used blue in the rocks of the St. Jerome, but only those in the middle distance. The celadon blue cast of the rocks in the St. Francis does seem to carry special significance, perhaps to reflect the heavenly light emanating from the clouds. It also gives more resonance to the hue of the saint's habit, which is painted with a lot of yellow and appears brighter and more colorful than the robes in Bellini's other depictions of St. Francis. In the larger pebbles to Francis's right, blue glazes were used for the shaded side, though now these thin glazes are rather worn. In the St. Jerome, the pebbles are multi-hued, something you only register at very close quarters, but which is typical of Bellini, inserting color wherever he can. As the richest material object in the painting, Francis's book would originally have provided a strong note of color. The cover is worn and faded, but fragments of intact red lake indicate that the entire cover of the book was deep red, with yellow embossed decorations at the corners and center. In 1660, in his poem exalting the virtues of Venetian paintings, the connoisseur and art dealer Marco Boschini writes, "Giambellino can be called the spring of the whole world in terms of painting, because from him comes all greenness, and without him, art is icy winter." For the wide variety of flora in the St. Francis, Bellini used 4 green pigments: the minerals malachite and pseudo-malachite, verdigris, a pigment manufactured from corroded copper, and a translucent copper green derived from verdigris. He expanded the range of hues and tones by use of selective underpaint, additional pigments, and modifying final glazes. In this way, he was able to achieve a rich variety for his foliage. For example, for the grass, he used a thin layer of verdigris over a lead tin yellow underpaint. You can see large particles of verdigris in the detail on the left. For the adjacent tree trunks, he used a thick layer of malachite over an underpaint that was a mixture of lead white, vermilion red, and a little copper-containing green. The speckled appearance of some of the leaves is due to the unexpected presence of a red lake on top of the green underlayer. This combination has, to my knowledge, only been found in Venetian paintings. Originally, it would have created a warm, resonant green. More importantly, many areas that were originally brilliant green have turned brown. This familiar phenomenon is caused by the deterioration of copper-containing green glazes. Where the glazes were applied over opaque yellowish-green underlayers, as in the grassy bank, the alteration is less marked, but at the top edge of the bank and in the mossy area on the rock at the right, the once green paint has definitely turned brown. Likewise, in the laurel tree, the now dark brown leaves at the perimeter, painted directly over the background, are those that have altered the most. By any standards, the painting is in remarkably good condition. But comparison with the great, exquisitely preserved Prato crucifixion, with its verdant landscape, gives some sense of how rich the greens of the St. Francis might originally have looked. I'd like to offer a few general comments about Bellini's approach to composition, and in particular about his treatment of light. The depiction of light was central to the planning and execution of his paintings. We don't know the original placement of the St. Francis, but it's possible that the very specific effects of light would have been tailored to a specific location. There are several altarpieces in situ, or whose original locations are known, where the light in the painting echoes the light entering the church or chapel. Here at San Zaccaria, the modeling and shadows reflect the high light from the left in the church. In San Giovanni Crisostomo, the light in the chapel comes from the right, and the painting reflects that. Note particularly the shadow cast by St. Christopher's staff on his leg. And in this detail, it's wonderful detail, you can see the impasted highlights on the face intended to catch the light from the right. Bellini relished the depiction of light on different surfaces, and he loved painting shadows. Earlier, I showed how he indicated areas of shadow in the underdrawing. Here in the X-ray, you see how in the initial stages of laying in color, he left areas of shadow in reserve so that they remained distinct compositional elements. In some places, he actually incised the contours of the shadows, a feature that's been observed in other paintings by the artist. In his great sacred allegory, he used incisions to capture another effect of light, carefully marking the reflections of the buildings in the glassy water of the lake. The painted shadows in the right foreground of the St. Francis are extremely detailed. Look, for example, at the set of 5 narrow shadows of the gatepost and fence at the right edge. However, as always in Bellini's paintings, naturalism is filtered by compositional needs. We don't, for example, see the shadow of Francis's arms. The lighting is theatrical rather than real. The shadows make the scene more believable, but they also contribute to the rhythm and harmony of the painting as a whole. They're part of the cascade of parallel diagonal lines, starting with the clouds in the upper left and continuing down through the bent tree, the hill, the foreground rock, and ending with the shadow of the saint's walking stick. This echoing and rhyming of forms and lines guides our eyes and creates a powerful internal cohesion. Theories abound, but the subject of the painting has never been fully established. The stigmatization of St. Francis was said to have taken place on Mount Laverna in 1224, 2 years before the saint's death. The Frick painting features elements of the stigmatization, but it's far from the conventional treatment of the subject that we see in Bellini's slightly earlier Predella scene from the Pesaro altarpiece, with its dramatic posture, winged seraph, 5 wounds, and Francis's companion, Brother Leo. With its tiny seraph and diminished rays, the stigmatization is already toned down from more dramatic representations, like this painting by Jacopo Bellini's teacher, Gentile da Fabriano. A tantalizing description of the painting by Boschini in 1660 mentions a Christ in the form of a fiery seraph, consistent with the established iconography of the stigmatization. So how can its absence on the picture be explained? It's long been known that the top edge of the painting has been cut. Unlike the other edges, it doesn't have an unpainted border, and the paint along the top edge is chipped, evidence that it was cut when the paint was already aged and embrittled. But why was the painting cut, and by how much? Could the section with the seraph have been removed deliberately to make the subject less specific? Or was the top of the painting trimmed to fit a specific frame or location, or due to damage? One of the pressing questions of the technical examination was to try to establish how much is missing at the top. The support was examined with the Met panel specialist, George Bazaka. Though the original cross pieces have long been removed, the nails that attached them were hammered through the front of the panel before the gesso was applied, as was typical, and most of the nail heads are still in place. Some now protrude from the surface due to shrinkage of the surrounding wood over time. The locations of others removed in the past can be identified by cracks and losses. The nails are visible in the X-ray, in the X-radiograph as highly X-ray opaque features. The red circles are around nails that are still present, and the blue locations where others were removed. The key features here are the pairs of nails in the 4 corners that were used to attach the top and bottom ends of the cross battens. This pairing of nails is unusual, but unquestionably original. In Italian panels, one often sees variations within the construction. For example, as here, the individual boards that make up the panel are of different sizes. But where practical features were concerned, symmetry would generally be maintained. The symmetrical arrangement of these double nails, top and bottom, is a strong indication that there's very little missing from the top of the panel, quite possibly little more than the width of the unpainted border seen at the other edges. On the face of the painting, no evidence of a seraph or crucifix could be found, only the rays of divine radiance, and these, as have been noted, don't enter the picture at a consistent angle. So the physical evidence remaining on the painting indicates that very little has been cut from the top, and the original incorporation of a seraph is unlikely. Boschini may have extrapolated its presence from the divine radiance. This, of course, has significant implications for the subject of the painting. So what then of the status of the wounds on the hands? Are they original, or were they added later, as has been suggested? And why does no wound appear on the foot or in the side? Examination of the wounds in the hands under high magnification showed that they're definitely part of the original painting. Made using an opaque red followed by a red lake glaze, the paint is aged and cracked through. Under high magnification, traces of red paint were also found on the foot, indicating that there was originally a wound here. This area is depicted in full light, and the smooth, hard surface of the paint would have made any detail painted on the surface susceptible to abrasion. Inadvertent abrasion from past cleanings has eroded the wound on the foot to the point of invisibility to the naked eye. I say inadvertent because there's no sign of scraping, no sign that it was deliberately removed. There's no indication that the artist ever planned on painting a wound in the side. This seems to be in keeping with the shift from the canonical to the suggestive approach to the depiction of the saint, so beautifully described by Keith Christensen here 2 weeks ago, and is consistent with the saint's upright stance and the downplaying of the other marks of the stigmata. The item tucked into the saint's belt has never been fully identified, but most plausibly it's a piece of paper or parchment that could represent the cartula, Francis's hymn of praise to God for Brother Leo, or another of his writings, like his canticle to the sun. Frustratingly, examination did not reveal any fragmentary inscription on the parchment or paper, and the marks at the bottom are small paint losses filled with old varnish, not red wax seals, as they've sometimes been read. This is, of course, entirely consistent with the suggestive rather than explicit theme of the painting. However, it is clear that this small detail was planned from the beginning by being drawn and held in reserve, so clearly it held significance. I've talked about Bellini's methodical approach to painting, which derived from his early use of tempera, a technique that necessitated careful planning. It's thus particularly interesting to see those places where the artist did make alterations to his composition. A number of changes were made around the figure of St. Francis. Behind him, the rock was originally in shadow, forming an alcove or niche of sorts. That's the dark area you can see in the infrared reflectogram. It's possible that he was planning a more defined recess, like the one depicted in this painting of the stigmatization by Marco Zoppo, a work Bellini might have seen when he visited Pesaro. Additionally, the low wall between the saint and the study was originally about half its present height. We can see this more clearly in the X-ray. During painting, Bellini lowered the wall and added the picture. Why did he make these changes? Perhaps he thought that the clearly defined recess in the rock and the larger expanse of bright ground behind Francis detracted focus from the saint. The molten recesses of the rock as they now are painted echo his stance and possibly recall the legend about the saint being attacked by the devil at Laverna and being saved by a miraculous melting of the rock behind him which sheltered him. The fluidly handled oil medium was certainly well suited to the depiction of molten rocks. The laurel tree that seems to bend in response to the heavenly radiance is a key feature of the painting. Taking into account that the reserved form of the tree needed to be smaller so that the more open foliage at the edges could be painted over the sky, it's clear that Bellini also made changes to the shape of the foliage as he painted. In its first iteration, the tree would have looked even more bowed. During painting, a significant series of changes was made in the right foreground in the saint's study. Initially, the desk terminated at the top of the slanted reading surface where you see the red line. Bellini added the flat shelf, the skull with its crown, and the cross with its crown of thorns over an already painted area at the back of the study. In the infrared image, you can see that he painted the horizontal shelf with its bracket over the existing willow fence, which shows through clearly, in order to provide a surface on which to place the skull. Here in the X-ray, you can see how the artist had to paint very thickly, how he had to build up the pale ochre paint of the shelf in order to cancel out the dark paint of the cave beneath. Having painted the shelf, Bellini added the cross, first incising its outline in the underlying paint. He then painted the skull over it. In order to give these added features some space, he shifted the far side of the lectern slightly to the left. As much of the drawing would have been covered at this point, Bellini marked the lectern's adjusted position by incising many of the lines into the underlying paint. Using a stylus, he first made little holes that he then joined up using a straight edge. The bell and the branch from which it hangs were also painted over the cave. You can see the grafted quality of the branch compared to the other carefully reserved branches. The skull and cross represent Calvary, the place of Christ's crucifixion, and are arranged for St. Francis' contemplation of Christ's passion as he sits at his desk. Their addition shows that Bellini's complex iconography was not entirely fixed at the outset, but rather that it evolved during painting. I'd like to conclude by thanking Michael Gallagher, Conservator-in-Chief of Paintings Conservation, and all my colleagues at the Met for their help with this study. And special thanks to Curator Denise Allen, Mellon Fellow Susanna Rutherglen, and New Media Specialist Lisa Candidge here at the Frick for what has been a wonderful collaboration. It's been a privilege and a joy to unlock some of the secrets of the St. Francis, and I hope that when you look at it again, you'll see even more in this magnificent painting. Thank you very much.